Hello class, welcome to part 2 on Plato's Republic, now covering Book 7 after the Myth of the Cave to 10. Reviewing the themes so far, we find in Book 1 the basic challenge of the work as a whole, how to define justice. Books 2 to 4 explore justice in terms of the just city, that is the harmony of a unitary body, soul, community, and cosmos. By necessity of unquenchable human desires and need for satiation, we are led from the healthy city to the luxurious city, and through the disciplined wing of the city, that is the guardian class, who oversees and purges the city of its unchecked appetitive element, the harmonious unity of the city being accounted for in terms of philosophers as the true leaders in politics, leading Plato to an in-depth discussion of the concept of philosophy and the philosopher's soul and body, and extensive discussions of the supreme idea, the idea of the good in terms of the analogy of the sun and the divided line. Beyond the analogy of the sun and the divided line, Book 7 begins with a third and cumulative image, the myth of the cave, which according to Protevi incorporates the ontological and epistemological dimensions of the first two images and includes the political and educational dimension. Protevi reads the myth of the cave in terms of three basic dimensions: logos, mythos, and ergon. The logos dimension is clearly seen in how the cave maps onto the divided line and philosophical research. The mythos dimension we can see in how the cave incorporates the themes of descent and ascent and of social life. And the ergon or action-work dimension of the cave is its educational meaning. Only living in a different world and following the path of education allows us to demystify the cave. This type of education cannot be mere information transfer, for that would be equivalent to merely a more accurate prediction of the next shadow or a more accurate mechanical explanation. Rather, it is a turning of the soul in the direction of the good and allowing people to see the world in terms of a teleological explanation. Once the myth of the cave is concluded, the rest of Book 7, as Protevi notes, gives us some of Plato's most democratic statements, such as the capacity to learn and the organ with which we do so are present in every person's soul, through which insight courses as by mysterious flashes, as if from above. After the cave allegory, the rest of Book 7 is concerned with the educational curriculum of the philosophers, that is the rational part of the soul, and how it must be directed upwards, towards higher things. It is here, after the myth of the cave, that Plato finally picks up the topic of the educational curriculum of the guardians, who are to become true philosophers. The subject study will include arithmetic, plane and solid geometry, astronomy, and harmonics. Since these disciplines lead epagoge, the soul, towards truth and facilitate the ascent, they are the summoners of logos. So it is here in Book 7 that Plato invents a strict distinction between theoretical and applied science. And oddly, to our ears at least, the theoretical sciences are otherworldly and internal. What Plato describes as astronomy sounds to us more like astrology. The point for Plato is not getting the heavens right, but internalizing them. And Plato's ridicule of most musicians basically says that his idea of music is truer than the musical ear, a fairly ridiculous part in the Republic as a whole. How are these various disciplines to be deployed in the education of the philosopher? Well, before the age of 20, guardians will learn only musicae and gymnasticae. In 20 to 30, they will learn arithmetic, plane and solid geometry, astronomy, and harmonics. Only from the ages of 30 to 40 will they learn dialectics and philosophy. Since if they learned dialectics any earlier, they'd become mere debaters and egotists. I guess that explains a lot about many male philosophy majors. At 533d, Plato refers the curriculum of the philosopher guardians back to the divided line. The main scientific disciplines instill a sense of likeness to the forms. It is dialectic that journeys to the first principles themselves in order to make them secure. According to Plato, the eye of the soul is really buried in a barbaric bog, and it needs dialectical philosophy in order to gently pull it out and lead it upwards. And the crafts or sciences techni just described help the soul and cooperate with it in turning the soul around. Recall in the divided line, belief or opinion and imagination is concerned with the world of becoming. Understanding or knowledge and thought are concerned with being. Note also that here in Book 7, the good and being are not distinguished. Having learned arithmetic, plane and solid geometry, astronomy, harmonics, dialectics, and philosophy, what is the final exam? For the would-be philosopher ruler, it is to explain the form of the good and distinguish it from everything else, and thus, as in a battle, to wake up to the good and never lose it. Those who fail this final exam will fall asleep in Hades forever. This educational curriculum of the philosopher is not as ascetic as it may at first appear. Philosophers must be hard workers, but also good at play. So we must look for someone who has a good memory, is persistent, and is wholeheartedly in love with hard work. For how else do you suppose anyone could carry out such hard physical labors as the training in gymnasticae requires, and also complete so much learning and training? Lacan replies, he would not unless his nature was an entirely good one. And here philosophy only loses its good reputation when illegitimate people take it up. And alas, these are the vast majority of our so-called philosophers. Natural aptitude is not enough. The true philosopher must be tireless, must possess all the virtues, and be genuinely in love with hard work. It is thus musicae which is the pre-training for the scientific and then philosophical arts. And the best pedagogy here is a playful one, since nothing compulsory ever remains or sticks in the soul. Only in playfulness is learning made secure. Only at the age of around 35 will the would-be philosophers be forced to go back into the cave, where they will take command in matters of war and other offices, learn politics, and this for a period of 15 years. At the age of 50, they will semi-retire from cave duties and commit themselves mostly to philosophy, but also to politics as needed. And they will be worshipped as the elders, the guardians, and the demi-divine, and easily make their way to the Isles of the Blessed. Will women too so be worshipped as elders, guardians, and demi-divine, go to the Isles of the Blessed along with the male philosophers? According to Plato, yes, but it's not difficult to note a definite preference for the male gender in Book 7 of the Republic. According to Proto-V, this emphasis reveals what we tend to forget in analyzing the myth of the cave. That is the way that it violently frames a transcendence of the feminine element, the womb, the earth, the underground, the body or labor base, and postulates a fundamentally male model of transcendence, wherein the feminine ideal, having nurtured the body of the philosopher, is supposed to merge into the background. Now, of course, according to the terms of the argument, in the just city, women and the children of workers based on merit are supposed to have an equal chance of becoming transcending philosopher kings. But this has to do with the abstract equality of particular men and women or individuals within different classes. It does not in fact concern the rigorous criteria of justice itself and the demands of philosophy, which are both resolutely male. Some have seen the underground cave that is to be left behind by the upward moving divine element as signifying the feminine element, the body labor base of male transcendence that is supposed to fade into the background to allow thought after having nurtured the body of the philosopher. This can lead us on a brief excursus into Irigaray's reading of the myth of the cave. Our guide here will be Vignes Songe-Moller and a couple of her chapters from Philosophy Without Women, The Birth of Sexism in Western Thought. In the chapter Two Views of Gender in Antiquity, she notes that the origins of misogyny that prevail in our philosophical traditions are to be found in ancient Greece. And this is because it is from Greece that we inherit our philosophical traditions. Of course, Greek misogyny itself can be situated in a deeper historical context. On the whole, in Greek philosophy, we find a view of gender according to which man is the exemplar of the human condition, and woman is subordinate. In Plato, woman is a negation of man, and in Aristotle, woman is a defective man. The impact of the philosophy of gender in ancient Greek philosophy on the entire history of Western philosophy cannot be underestimated. Even Sartre describes slime and music as symbols of the feminine to be dissociated from to achieve authentic life. And even Simone de Beauvoir's language remains tied at times to misogynistic metaphors, woman as immanence, or masculine sexuality as a model for women to aspire to, since it is more free and authentic. For Songe-Moller, the Ionian thinkers offered frameworks that could accommodate sexual difference without hierarchy. Even when the battle of conflicting forces was emphasized, we do not find in the majority of the pre-Socratics a strict gender hierarchy or prioritizing of the male gender. Here, Songe-Moller traces strict gender hierarchy to Parmenides, Empedocles, and Greek tragedy. Between Parmenides and Plato and Aristotle, women come to be thought as independent beings, but still situated within an essentialist gender hierarchy. Alongside Helena Cixous and a few others, Irigaray is one of the most famous and accomplished French feminist philosophers of the late 20th century. Her extended 150-plus page reading of the Plato's cave myth we find in her magnum opus based on her doctoral dissertation, Speculum of the Other Woman, a text which has received hardly any attention from Plato's scholars, historians of philosophy, or teachers of the subject. Why hasn't Irigaray's interpretation of the cave myth been more widely read, engaged with, and taught? Is it her unconventional style, perhaps? According to Irigaray, sexual difference is in fact core to the overall argument of the Republic. Plato's ontology and epistemology are not simply gender neutral, as a vast majority of Plato's scholars have taken them to be, but rather the consequences of a highly specific view about the relation between the sexes, sexuality, and reproduction. According to Irigaray, Plato's philosophy implies an ideal of propagation that is independent of sexuality, that is, propagation through dialectical knowledge. And this ideal is in effect the very foundation of Western philosophy. In this way, the Platonic attitude towards sexual difference lies at the very core of the Western mindset. Her basic tenet is that the cave in Plato's myth is an image or a metaphor for something else which the image itself in some way resembles. What the cave in fact resembles is sexed versus asexual being and reproduction. In her view, the way our language functions, namely in terms of metaphors, reflects a very particular view of the relation between masculine and feminine, and of the respective roles of the father and the mother in reproduction. The father tending to reproduce asexually through culture, legacy, and philosophy, and the mother physically, allied to the appetitive rather than the rational part of the soul. The title of Irigaray's essay on Plato's myth of the cave is thus Plato's Hystera, the term hystera being the Greek word for uterus, from which we get the modern English hysteria. The hystera within Plato's sexed metaphors is wandering and uncertain, many-headed, and indeed monstrous, much like in Sigmund Freud's theories about female hysteria. What Irigaray will attempt to underline is the feminine or hysterical relation to tradition. As Toril Moy has shown, Irigaray regards hysteria often as a woman's only means of getting her voice heard within what she calls the logic of the patriarchate. Hysteria amounts to an imitation, a mime of masculine discourse. And this is also Irigaray's own method, miming Plato, in order to analyze his sexual metaphors. Plato's text becomes the subject of an ironic imitation, a kind of deformed reflection. Irigaray equates the cave, from which the cave myth takes its name, with the uterus, but her claim goes deeper. By means of this mimetic device, Plato is effectively exploiting the female body and its functions as a source of images and metaphors to explain knowledge. We could say that the philosopher is equipped with a metaphoric or male uterus by analogy to that of the female, and according to which the true organ of reproduction is no longer the female body, but the one that propagates genuine knowledge, namely masculine thought. Plato's mimetic, hysterical exploitation of women's bodies in the cave myth is not a mere artistic device, but reveals something about his method of seeking enlightenment. The teaching story is itself a mimetic of the good. Book 8 then returns to the topic that was interrupted by all the digressions starting in Book 5. That is, to the 5 basic types of political constitutions and types of souls corresponding to them. For Protevi, Book 8 raises some questions very relevant to us Americans, such as whether we today in the US have a democracy, and if so, of what kind, and whether the market, as classically conceived, is self-organizing, or how historical capitalism, which has always sought government intervention, relates to the classic theory of the market. The important thing for Protevi is to see the difference between history as movement on a map and history as linear narrative. For Plato, the types of constitutions are laid out something as a map, which he misleadingly puts into a unidirectional linear narrative of progress or of decline. Plato's narrative of the degeneration of the city and the soul from better to worse begins from a golden age construction of Callipolis as a utopian city that has never existed, might exist in principle, and is loosely mapped in Plato on Hesiod's myth of the 4 ages. The aristocratic age maps onto the gold and silver age, the timocratic or honor-loving onto the bronze age, and the oligarchic or rule by elite families onto the iron age, with democracy and tyranny being new and recent developments. For Protevi, when we read Plato's Politics in Book 8 of the Republic, we begin from the reminder that there is no entry into history based on investigation of principles. In reality, we seldom if ever see linear narratives, but rather jumps between different types of regimes in which principles are attractors and revolutions bifurcations. Having already established the principles of an aristocratic city as ruled by philosophers and the 3 classes in Callipolis, Plato now discusses the timocratic city, that is ruled by the spirited part of the soul and which is victory and honor-loving, much like the Spartans. According to Plato in Book 8, it is difficult for the truly well-ordered city to devolve, but everything that comes to be must decay, and nothing will last forever. The decline of Callipolis begins absurdly when the wrong children are produced at the wrong times. And Plato's numerological explanations of astronomy and in its relation to childbirth and child-rearing is complete mumbo-jumbo here. Plato, the honor-loving city, begins when children compete for honors in gymnastics and ignore musicae and reason. What results will be factions emerging from unjust claims to power, mastery, domination, and war. And the timocratic city is mixed, neither wholly good nor wholly bad. The aristocratic city turns into the timocratic on the level of the soul when the jealous wife complains of her man's lack of recognition. The son overcompensates, becoming an honor-loving son individualized within his family. Once democracy, or the warrior culture of honor and victory, has been established, there will gradually emerge a regime based on property assessment in which the rich rule and the poor are ruled. This occurs because the timocratic ruling families will amass wealth, property, and the spoils of war. Their descendants turn into managers of their estates, and the poor will realize their only chance of self-governance lies in becoming rich. Political decisions, a seat at the table of political self-determination, will only be available to those who meet the property assessments. In the oligarchic city, wealth becomes the measure of power rather than victory in battle, honor, and virtue. When mercenary armies come to replace the guardian class, destitution and thievery among the poor grows, and everyone but the rulers become beggars. At the level of the soul, the oligarchic city gets its impetus when a son sees his father lose his honor, power, and wealth, and realizes that hanging on to and growing his estate is the most important goal of life. Humbled by poverty, honor and spiritedness become less important. Money becomes the highest value. The democratic city emerges from this same desire for personal wealth and prosperity, but among the disenfranchised. In the oligarchic city, the poor and rich will still often work together on city projects, trade campaigns, and the poor will realize they are just as, if not more worthy than the rich. Furthermore, the descendants of the rich will have been made soft by luxuries and a disorderly soul, while the poor will be lean and tough and think regarding the rich, these men are for our taking, they are good for nothing. At 557a, then democracy comes about, I suppose, when the poor are victorious, kill or expel the others, and give the rest an equal share in the constitution and ruling office, and the majority of offices in it are assigned by lot. Even the democratic city has its good points for Plato. It is a city full of freedom and the freedom of speech, but also too much license to do whatever one wishes. Its people, like its constitution, will be multifarious, even beautiful at times, like a quote embroidered cloak. Its laws will be more flexible, and its verdicts changeable. According to Plato, the democratic city is a very complex society, rooted in assigning of a sort of equality to equals and unequals alike. That is, in the principle of abstract equality. At the level of the soul, the democratic character emerges as the son of a moral and thrifty oligarchic man, whose ideal constraints are soon lost in real chaotic democratic regimes, that is, in constantly revaluing values based on what best suits the will of the majority. The democratic individual becomes exceedingly interesting and complex. Plato explicitly notes that when the Democrat parties, they party hard, and same with exercise, but they do both inconsistently. They are sometimes industrious, sometimes lazy, sometimes dabbling in philosophy, sometimes politics, the military, money-making, and everything. Democratic man is a man for all seasons and devoted to legal equality. At 561e, I certainly think he is a multifarious man and full of all sorts of characters, beautiful and complex, like the democratic city. On Plato's democratic regime, Bertavie writes, for Plato, democracy is the rule of the many, of the hoi polloi, the demos, the mob. And the genesis of this regime comes from the excessive desire of people under an oligarchy to be rich. Since, however, it is impossible to honor wealth and moderation at the same time, some nobles are reduced to poverty and come to desire revolution. That is, they join with the Democrats against fellow nobles in the oligarchy. Not only is poverty the positive source of wealth, but it is also in most cases a stabilizing influence, as a moderate level of poverty of the many keeps them working at jobs that produce wealth for the owners. After all, stable subsistence is better than death from starvation or the risk of death in revolution. However, sometimes this stabilizing effect of moderate poverty is overcome, since desire for money and wealth is unlimited. The most immoderate of the rich will even impoverish their fellow rich, thus destabilizing the system. And here we have to remember that ancient cultures like Athens privileged land and agricultural output over money as the noble sources of wealth. Being a businessman chasing money, however, was illiberal. Next, tyranny evolves naturally from democracy, from the same excessive desires for wealth and pleasure that produced disorder in oligarchic societies. Here, the widespread permissiveness, i.e. tolerance, in democratic regimes ends up being what enslaves it. It needs a leader, like the many-headed Hydra needed a Hercules. In democratic regimes, extreme freedom often becomes interchangeable with extreme slavery. This eminent freedom of all is the condition which gives rise to the excessive freedom of the tyrant or the sovereign. And here Plato sounds a bit like Thomas Hobbes. Tyranny is born when the will of a majority gather around a decisive and charismatic leader who promises them great things, such as debt forgiveness, redistributed land, etc., but ends up enslaving them, at first without their realizing it, and graciously, and then later through fear and terror. In the democratic come tyrannical regime, the friend-enemy distinction is eroded. In its place emerges a control society with sycophancy to the tyrant and his cabinet as the organizing principle. In his now classic book, Oedipus Philosopher, French theorist Jean-Joseph Goux gives an interesting interpretation of the figure of the tyrant in Plato's Republic in terms of the character of Oedipus in Sophocles' drama. Remember Oedipus Rex or Oedipus Tyrannus? The cursed and yet self-initiated autodidact who killed his father, married his mother, and ruled in Thebes for 15 years before discovering that the oracle was right. Oedipus, you will recall, began as a very promising young man raised by adoptive parents in the city of Corinth after his own parents had exposed him. In Sophocles, he rejects the traditional teachings of the wise priest Tiresias and denies the validity of oracles, at least when they don't suit his purposes. His initiation and right to be king of Thebes begins when he solves the riddle of the Sphinx, which he does so on his own merit and in light of his own reason, that is, without the instruction of the priestly class. In a way, his initiation solving of the riddle of the Sphinx is only a delaying of his tragic destiny. He less defeats the Sphinx than makes her disappear, and therein ensues 15 tranquil years of his rule in Thebes, and the siring of 4 children with, unbeknownst to him, his own mother. According to Goux, Oedipus's mythic trajectory from cursed wanderer to sovereign in Thebes can be understood as a failed royal investiture or a failed religious initiation. Legitimate though he may be as the king of Thebes, his rise to power is predicated on functional crimes, the murder of the father and the marriage with the mother. And the result, at least in Sophocles' portrayal of the character of Oedipus, is that of a tyrannical king whose will to knowledge and control or rulership is ultimately his own undoing. Goux's analysis is nuanced and detailed, and I highly recommend his book for an essay for this class. For our purposes here, it suffices to summarize Goux's interpretation of Book 8 of the Republic. If the best political and psychic constitution is monarchy, in which the hierarchy of functions in the soul is perfectly regulated, the worst is tyranny, in which there is a maximum deviance, the inferior parts taking the upper hand in the city-state and the soul alike. The philosopher king is needed to bring order and harmony both to the soul and the city. And so, by definition, except for the rigorous initiation to philosophy, the philosopher king is already analogous to the tyrant. And here in Plato, this opposes his political model as a whole very much to Ionian isonomia. According to Goux, Oedipus is seen by Sophocles as a philosopher tyrant, a non-initiate who usurps the royal function, and in this way Sophocles himself remained faithful to a sacerdotal vision of truth. In the end, it is Tiresias whose position proves to be correct. According to Sophocles, the philosopher can only be such a disordered tyrant since through intellectual presumptuousness he has avoided authentic initiation. And so for Goux, the Oedipus myth marks the moment of the Greek exit from the ideology of a functional tripartition, according to which there are 3 basic domains of Indo-European society: sacred sovereignty in Plato's Callipolis, the philosopher king; or philosopher guardians, political or military sovereignty in Plato's model, the guardian class or auxiliaries, and sexuality or fertility, which in Plato's model is associated with the appetitive part of the soul as opposed to the spirited and rational, and tends to predominate among the producer class. In order to understand Plato's philosophical conception of tyranny and understanding of the tyrant, we must for Goux return to his image of the soul and notice its monstrosity. In Plato's own words and theory of the tripartite soul, the soul indeed resembles one of those natures that the ancient fables tell of, that of a chimera or scula or Cerberus, and the numerous other examples that are told of the many forms grown together in one. The tripartite soul is indeed a philosophical image of tripartite monstrous animals, or anima images in Greek mythology, such as here on the right where you see a chimera, a tripartite beast consisting of serpent, lion, and goat, which is defeated by the hero Bellerophon riding Pegasus, another tripartite image. According to Goux, the many-headed or polycephalic beast is the part of the soul that is the seat of sensual desires, multiple and unlimited, that is the concupiscent element, the serpent, or sexual fertility. The lion is the irascible component, the fierce and audacious part that never ceases to aspire to domination and victory. In Callipolis, this is the spirited part of the soul, or the guardian auxiliary class. The man himself is for Plato the wise and the rational element of the soul, and the one that derives pleasure only from the knowledge of truth. This would be the hero mastering the monstrous animal soul, or his anima, and in Plato the image of the true man or philosopher. That in Greek mythology, the inner man is itself cast in the image of a monster. Oedipus is Sphinx, Bellerophon chimera, Hercules is Hydra, and many other examples. Plato's philosophical psychology, and here in his Politics of Tyranny, the triple monster has been internalized, sublimated, and refined, something with which it is possible to deal rationally and philosophically. Goux notes how Plato's tyrant is consummately Oedipian, and how the crimes in Plato's Republic of the paradigmatic tyrant are precisely the crimes of Oedipus. Plato, the tyrant, is the counter-image to the genuine philosopher-king. The tyrant will fully implement Thrasymachus' rule of the stronger and not flinch from using violence against the people and even his own father. Everything political will become about the control system under the tyrant's will. As Socrates states at 569c, a tyrant is a parasite as you describe him, and then a harsh nurse of old age. And we do now seem to have an acknowledged tyranny, and so the people, by trying to avoid the proverbial frying pan of enslavement to free men, have fallen into the fire of having slaves as their masters, and in exchange for their excessive and inappropriate freedom, have put upon themselves the harshest and most bitter slavery to slaves. Having introduced the ultimate descent from best to worst, from aristocracy to tyranny, described all of its features, both at the level of the city and the soul, Book 9 begins with a more in-depth psychology of the tyrant himself. Here Plato explores the cave that the tyrannical man evolves from the democratic one, and is the most unhappy of all the psychic types, since it derives from the bestial or savage element in the soul that must be controlled, otherwise it will usurp the honor and reason-loving parts of the soul. Thus the tyrant will not shrink from trying to have sex with a mother or with anyone else, man, god, or beast. This is where Hadot derives Plato's teaching on good sleep and dreams, and how we can soothe the spiritual element before bed with reason, and then our dreams are the least lawless. The drunk is similar to the tyrant for Plato and acts out of the tyranny of the passions and an undivine madness. The tyrannical part of the soul, rooted in the appetites, is the part that goes in for festivals and revelries and luxuries and girlfriends and all that sort of thing. But they soon spend all their resources on themselves and are always on the prowl for new pleasures due to their addictions. Addiction being traced for Plato to the absence of habitual excessive pleasure, which then becomes experienced as overwhelming pain. According to Plato, the addict and the tyrant are very similar, since they both live in the greatest possible condition of suffering and torment. In the case of the addict, it drives him to steal, lie, cheat, and seize by force the means of securing his sources of pleasure, enslaving everyone else to his addiction. Originating the gateway drug theory of addiction, Plato here writes that small evils lead to greater ones. As the tyrannical soul is drawn along ineluctably by bad people like himself, into pure vice. In this way, the tyrant never gets to experience true pleasure or true friendship. Rather, the tyrant becomes his own slave and is ever spiritually poor and insatiable. True happiness and the greatest pleasures are only available to those whose souls and bodies are well ordered. And in this way, the tyrant becomes the most wretched of all men. What is an even worse tragedy than witnessing the self-destruction of the tyrant in the soul is when the tyrannical element actually becomes a ruler and ends up holding the whole city in thrall to their whim through pain, fear, violence, and control. At this point in Book 9, Plato turns to a discussion of the three types of pleasure, which is the precursor conversation to Aristotle's discussion of the three ways of life in his Politics. There is the hedonic life, or life devoted to pleasure, the bios hedonikos, the political life, or bios politikos, and the philosophical life, or bios theoretikos in Aristotle. Already here in Plato, the true philosopher king loves the theoretical life most, and is the most qualified to lead political life from this basis. The least qualified ruler is the tyrant because he makes political life a slave to his own passions. Between the two is the timocratic and democratic man and form of government, which are sometimes drawn one way or another, from worse to better or from better to worse. Ultimately, for Plato, while it may seem like the tyrant and the corrupt city has an excess in pleasure, in reality their pleasures are muffled and destroyed by the corrupt order in their souls. And this concludes Book 9 of Plato's Republic. As we approach Book 10, Plato returns to a major topic of Book 2 and 3, that is the censorship of the poets or artists and the role of music in Callipolis. You may recall that he had there quoted Damon, for one can never change the ways of training people in music without affecting the greatest political laws. And this is because nomos, which means both law and song, is a nomos both for the soul and for the order in the city. In Books 4 to 5, Plato refines the ideas behind his proposed censorship plans and argues that the soul is tripartite, and he therein locates the arts, that is gymnasticae and musicae, within the spirited parts of the soul. Arts and athletics are said to be good when they are in accord with the rational pursuit of the good life, that is, with philosophy, temperance, or sophrosune, and good statesmanship, rather than merely being in accord with appetitive desire. When it comes to musicae and the arts, what is in harmony with the body politic and its theological grounds and revelations is good. The rest is a noxious poison or pharmaca. Plato had earlier defined the elements of the song or poem as word, harmony, and rhythm. These as well we can now see correspond to the three parts of the soul, proposing to censor all word, speech, and poetry that does not cohere with virtuous human flourishing. Plato had also earlier banished harmonies and rhythms or musical modes that lead to any sort of psychic illness or disorder. And this involves the famous banishment of flute playing, since it is the instrument of Dionysus. Elsewhere in Plato, in the Laws, this censorship of Dionysus is both extended and modified. There, Plato writes that older men should be allowed the pleasures of wine, but not young people. Moreover, the orgiastic types of Dionysian festivals now common among the Greeks are to be banished entirely because they are simply apolitical. That is, outside of and corrosive of the political harmony in the well-ordered city. At the outset of Book 10 of the Republic, Plato returns to the question of the censorship of the arts in Callipolis, and he strengthens his claim that we should ban imitative poetry because it maims the senses and reasoning. Here, Plato's critique of the poet is extended, deepened, and grounded, and it all hinges on Plato's definition of poiesis as mimesis, poetry as imitation. Recall in the Ion the Heraclean chain of inspiration that leads from a god through a great poet like Homer, and then to the lesser stages of the choral magnet, such as the rhapsodist, who merely receives his imitation from Homer, thus once removed from the truth or the god, and then translates it to his audience, who is a full 3 removes from the god. This same hierarchical model in terms of nearness to the source is now in Book 10 reconceptualized, according to the doctrine that poets are literally makers or poetes, but they are not makers in the ordinary sense, i.e. artisans, though what they make is imitations, but not imitations of things, rather of gods, heroes, nature, and life. Oddly here, carpenters and other artisans of actual artifacts fare better in terms of originality, since their products are only once removed from the ideas, the form of the table, or the form of the vase. Poets, however, are even more removed from the forms, since they are the imitators of imitations, just as the rhapsodists in the Ion were interpreters of interpreters. Book 10 is thus the locus classicus for one of Plato's most fundamental definitions of mimesis or imitation, and his premises are weird but important. Premise 1, what is more original is to be more valued. Premise 2, all formed material things are copied or representations of intelligible prototypes. And on the basis of these two premises, Plato's conclusion, the poet's copies of heroic or kingly deeds and the painter's copies of real natural objects are a full 3 steps removed from the original patterns in the ideas. Plato thus severs the link between poetry or art and absolute truth of the forms in order to reforge it from the perspective of the philosopher who knows the form. Poets may be under a divine or demonic inspiration, but they are still subject to their own lack of knowledge and their rendering of an imitation. They are not to be trusted as leaders of culture or as individuals outside the cave, since in a very real sense they know not what they do and cannot give an account of the form. What they provide us with are not even real beds or real objects modeled on the prototype, but rather fanciful reconstructions that augment to the point of absurdity the shadows on the cave wall. Glaucon is a bit puzzled at this point, since Socrates also suggests that this entire world is a product of imitation, and identifies the source or origin or prototype of that which all other artisans and poets imitate as being the forms themselves, but here in the mind of a divine craftsman who creates all of the visible world, not only every manufactured item, but all the plants that grow from the earth and all the animals, including himself. In addition, he produces earth and sky and gods and everything in the sky and everything in Hades and on the earth. This is at 596c of the image of the cosmic demiurge, who we also find in Plato's Timaeus. The demiurge creates all things in the world by mirroring the intelligible ideas or prototypes into all appearing material forms or instances. And so the demiurge is, in a very real sense, Plato's God, beyond and above which few things reside, except being itself or forms themselves in the good. The function of the God in Plato is very different than in Judeo-Christianity, and it might take a minute to wrap our heads around this. The Abrahamic God is the literal creator out of nothing of the world and of all its specific essences. Plato's demiurge God, however, is not a creative deity, but rather a mirroring one. God, or the divine itself in its highest form, did not create the world of nature and the many things, but rather is a liminal or mediating force that mirrors the worlds of the forms and the good into material existence. The divine is what lifts up or helps material existence to ascend the ladder towards participation in the forms. Poets and artisans who model their work on the forms in the mind of the cosmic demiurge produce excellent work, whereas those who model themselves on each other, rather than divine itself, produce imitations that are at the second or third degree removed from the model or form. Not a creation ex nihilo deity, Plato's demiurge is still a maker god. God makes this sensible, derivative world more like the forms by informing them, and this making is, according to Plato, a mirroring of the forms into existing things, bringing about their participation in the form, but not creating the essence itself. At this point in Book 10 of the Republic, Plato sets his hairpin target squarely on Homer. It's clear that Plato, like any Greek, loves and admires Homer, but as we read earlier in the Republic, also has many critical things to say about particular Homeric passages and the ethos they reflect. In the Ion, Homer was the source possessed by a muse, which the rhapsode receives at a second hand from the god. In Book 10 of the Republic, Homer himself is a mere imitator, that is not a reliable or accurate source for insight into the world of the forms. With respect to the cosmic demiurge and the divine itself, even Homer as a poet is 3 steps removed from the origin and truth. Now, Book 10 of Plato's Republic can seem a bit arcane and strange. We shouldn't get too caught up in the weird metaphysics. And obviously, from our modern perspective, it's just absurd to take seriously the idea that there is only one form of the bed, and that God or the demiurge made only one bed, which all the particular artisans imitate as model. It seems that in Book 10, Plato's philosophical strategy and approach ostensibly depends on his theory of forms, but it is really more oriented by his ethical and political observations and intent. It pains Socrates to say so because, like all Greeks, he was raised to love and adore Homer, but a closer look at the effects of Homer's poetry in Greek society reveals that it has done almost nothing of any discernible good. Homer and all the poets are imitators, pure and simple, i.e. they are not heroes and are not truly in touch with the gods. What Greek culture up to this point, up to Plato, according to his own estimation, provides is not concrete invention or improvement of life, but rather a sometimes enjoyable and a beautiful and sometimes corrupting and destructive entertainment. This is one of the strangest links in all of Plato's Republic, since earlier the topic of Homer was broached, but not explicitly expounded. Plato's main target in the censorship of the poets in books 2 and 3 was the tragic poets of his own era, but in Book 10 of the Republic we get an odd argument, according to which Homeric epic and the tragic poets are really of the same ilk and type. This doctrine of the poetic soul and its removal from truth is novel to Plato, and tragic poetry and the earlier epic tradition are not usually run together like this in Greek thought. Plato is able to draw this point of the interconnection between Homeric fantasy and tragic fantasy on the basis of his emphasis of the care of the soul and the good life in Callipolis. According to this argument, unlike the pre-Socratic sages, the Homeric bards and tragic poets equally contribute no invention and found no original way of life. What their arts lead to is celebrity, that is, an overvaluation of what will come to be called the aesthetic, but which is at the same time a distracting fantasy and ontologically a mere imitation. Here, Plato's greatest charge against imitative poetry as a whole, from Homer to tragedy, is not only that it is 3 steps removed from the truth per se, but more practically that it is rooted in the dark alliance of spirit and passion, that is, of the spirited and appetitive parts of the soul, and that it tends to pursue its course and arts in a counter-rational rather than a wise way. If there is to be poetry and art in Callipolis, it will have to be strictly regulated. Book 10 thus constitutes the strongest statement of what will come to be known as the ancient quarrel between philosophy and poetry. According to Plato, no knowledge undergirds poetry, for the poets are ignorant. Poetry relies on inspiration, not reason. It propagates falsehood. It arouses irrational passions and displaces reason. And it is intoxicating because of the seductive charms of rhythm, meter, and harmony, all of which are topics more extensively explored in Book 10. Most philosophically, poetry imitates appearance and not reality. It is thus a lower-level metaphysics. And this is Plato's doctrine of poetry as mimesis in Book 10. In short, poetry should be more or less completely banned if it cannot, in a given instance, be justified by reason. Note, Plato is not saying there'll be no poetry because that would be contradictory to the education of the guardians in Musicae. Rather, he's saying that the specific instances or types of poetry must be justified by reason to become an authentic part of the guardian's curriculum. Now nearing to the end of Book 10 of the Republic, and after his denunciation of the poets, Plato gives poetry a chance to redeem itself, writing, "We will give her champions, not poets themselves, but poet lovers, an opportunity to make her defense in plain terms, and show that she is not only sweet, as we all know, but also helpful to society and the life of man, and we will listen in a kindly spirit, for we shall be gainers, I take it, if this can be proved." Ultimately, therefore, Plato's attitude towards the poets and poetry is sympathetic, though stern, and we can in part read Aristotle's Poetics, which we'll discuss briefly in a couple of weeks, as a reply to this passage. As Gilles Deleuze points out, in Difference and Repetition and elsewhere, what is always at stake in Plato's method of dialectical discovery is a contest between the authentic knower of the form and the many pretenders. And in this way, Plato's staged metaphysics of mimesis or imitation, in terms of closeness to the origin or form, is a tool through which we can distinguish the victor and authentic individual in any given contest as the philosopher. This ethico-political import is more historically significant in Book 10 than the weird metaphysics in which it is couched. I wanted at this point to introduce us in the course to the work of Giorgio Agamben, and especially the short piece in appendix to his book, What is Philosophy? The Supreme Music, since it is particularly helpful to situate in a contemporary context the relevance of Plato's overall discussion of Musicae, censorship, and the city in books 2, 3, and 10 of the Republic. Agamben is a contemporary Italian philosopher and still active at the age of 78, and he's likely the greatest living continental philosopher in the world, in my opinion. When he was young, he attended Heidegger's seminars in France, and Heidegger seems to have been quite fond of him, as you can see in these pictures. Agamben begins this short piece, which is clearly very much indebted to Plato's Republic, with the claim that today philosophy is possible only as a reformation of music. This is not a new problematic, but a very old one, and it's the central problematic of Plato's Republic. Music, or muse, is the experience of an actual muse, not just aesthetic sound, the origin and taking place of the word. It was this deep enshrining of the concept of muse, music, or musicae, in terms of inspiration from a muse as the source or origin, and as the origin of language, that Plato is both indebted to and takes to task in the Republic and also elsewhere in the Cratylus. The difficulties here and Plato's failure to carry off the final victory of philosophy over poetry goes back to the simple idea that there is no pure language or logos independent of music and the muse. For Agamben, as for Plato's own contemporaries, the origin of language can only be evoked or reminisced musaically or musically, which is to say, there is no pure word or logos independent of the sonorous dimension as well as the religious. The Greeks thus spoke of the 9 muses, or 9 modalities in which the word takes place or becomes an event. And Hesiod's beginning from the muses and his unique experience of them is a basic initiatory origin of poetic language. In Agamben's reading of Republic 398 to 399, emotional moods necessarily belong to music before belonging to words. Balanced, courageous, and strict in the Doric musical mode, mournful and languid in the Ionic and the Lydian. And for Agamben, it is peculiar that still in the masterpiece of 20th century philosophy and Heidegger's Being and Time, the original opening of man to the world does not take place through rational knowledge and language, but through a Stimmung, that is, an emotional mood, and this very term refers back to the acoustic sphere, Stimme meaning voice. For Agamben, the muse, music, marks the splitting between man and his language, between the voice and logos, and the primary opening of the human being to the world is not logical but musical. And it is from this point of view that we can witness the peculiar and novel suggestion of Plato's Republic in its views on music as a whole. Whereas in all previous thought, word follows harmony and rhythm, in Plato, harmony and rhythm must follow logos. Plato focuses for the first time almost exclusively on what is language in the song, and suggests that music and language are separable. In his context, such a severing can by no means be taken for granted as it is for us. During the 5th and the 4th centuries BCE, new musical styles emerged constantly in Greece and tended to fracture linguistic and musical unity. The word emerged as dominant, and this is a trait shared by Plato and the sophists. Music gradually began to become independent and to pursue its art form independently of dance and the word, music, dance, and the word all being components of Plato's concept of musicae. For more on this fascinating topic, you can check out Thrasyboulos Georgiadis' short book, Greek Music, Verse, and Dance. For better or for worse, Plato's critique of the poets and of musicae, and his severing within musicae of language from gesture, tone, rhythm, and harmony, prioritizing of the idea or form within language or logos, and dialectic philosophy, as Socrates had taught the highest form of music, still seems today excessively conservative, and yet these Platonic critiques were repeated throughout the centuries, and in the end formed the basis of music's own self-understanding as a branch of human culture distinct from language and reason. For Agamben, if our access to the world is still, in a certain sense, musaically determined, we gain a better basis for understanding the Greeks, for whom the nexus between music and politics was so evident that Plato and Aristotle treat musical questions only in the works that they consecrate to politics. Quote, the relation of what they called musicae, which included poetry, music, and dance, with politics is so close in the Republic that Plato subscribes to Damon's aphorism, according to which musical modes cannot be changed without changing the fundamental laws of the city. This makes sense in Plato's cultural context, insofar as men come together and organize the constitutions of their city through language, but the experience of language, insofar as it is not possible to grasp and master its origin, is in turn already conditioned musically. Music is thus one of the chief vehicles of social control, and this is why Plato devotes so much attention to it in the Republic. According to Agamben, the Greeks knew perfectly well what we tend to ignore, namely, that it is first possible to manipulate and control a society not only through language, but first and foremost through music. Just as for a soldier the trumpet blast or a drum beat is effective and more superior than a spoken command, so in every field and before every discourse, the feelings and moods that precede action and thought are musically determined and oriented. And in this sense, the state of music, which is really a better term for what Plato had in mind here than art, defines the political conditions of a given society better than and prior to any other index. If we truly want to modify the rules of a city, it is first of all necessary to reform its music. And Agamben can still say today, sounding very much like Plato in the Republic, the bad music that today pervades our cities at every moment and in every place is inseparable from the bad politics that governs them. With Plato, philosophy indeed emerges as the critique and overcoming of the reigning musical organization of the Athenian polis. Seen as a vehicle of divine destiny, from which the possessed rhapsode and the spectators are suspended, Plato in the Republic comes out against this musaic paideia or musical education, and claims for the first time philosophy as the true muse and the supreme music. Plato's goal here, as in the Phaedo, is to go back beyond and before inspiration towards that event of the word whose threshold is shielded and barred by the muse. And for this reason, Plato can define philosophy as auta e musa, or the muse herself. According to Agamben, Plato's emphasis on philosophy over music in the Republic is a situating of the philosopher within the original event of language. The philosopher brings man back to the place of his becoming human, i.e. the logos, the only place from which he can remember the time in which he was not yet a man. Philosophy in its Platonic form is constituted as a trespass of musaic principles. A poet, under the inspiration of a muse, is also in archaic thought the repository of memory, the muses themselves being the daughters of memory, Mnemosyne, and the three original muses being Melite, Iode, and Memne. In this way, we can best understand Plato's teaching that knowledge is recollection or anamnesis, remembering, as an essential step in Plato's trespass on traditional musaic principles. Only the philosopher completes the journey, or nostos, in the direction of memory, truly acquires through his knowledge of the forms Mnemosyne, and in this way is not at the whims of a muse, but rather becomes a free individual, free from the divine fate or destiny, and thus for the first time in a realm in which freedom and thought are possible on the basis of philosophical principles and mastery of a language beyond its musaic origin. In fact, thought is the dimension that is opened up when, going back beyond the musaic inspiration that does not allow man to know what he says, man somehow becomes the auctor, that is, the guarantor and the witness of his own words and his own actions. This model of autonomous thought and autonomous self-development in light of the philosophic muse being Plato's teaching and way of life, the bios theoretikos, which should undergird and control the world of politics and action. According to Agamben, what contemporary music and philosophy, and for that matter, politics is still missing, is precisely this deeper experience of the symmetry and rupture of music and logos inaugurated in the Platonic project. If music is constitutively bound to the experience of the limits of language, and if vice versa, the experience of the limits of language and politics is musically conditioned, then an analysis of the music of our times should begin by noting that it is precisely this experience of the musaic limits that music is now missing. Language is today given as a chatter that never clashes with its limit and seems to have lost all awareness of its intimate nexus with what cannot be said, that is, with the time when man was not yet a speaker, but a musician. A language without margins and frontiers corresponds to a music that is no longer musaically tuned, and a music that has turned its back on its origins corresponds to a politics without consistency in place. The continuing relevance of Plato's Republic to our society. For us, it seems that everything can be indifferently said is mere meaning, information, and in this way singing disappears, and with it the emotional moods that are always articulated musaically. Our society, in which music seems frenetically to pervade everywhere, is actually the first human community that is neither musaically nor amusaically tuned. The general feeling of depression and apathy only registers the loss of the musaic nexus within language. Our way of thinking goes round and round in circles of information and discourse that eclipse the political, precisely in being no longer inspired from a plurality of musaic contents. Separating language and music, both end up being consigned to the same vacuity. For Agamben, what is essential is that the link between music and language be reforged. If, following Hannah Arendt's suggestion, thought coincides with the ability to interrupt the meaningless flux of sentences and sounds, stopping this flux in order to give it back to its musaic place is today the ultimate philosophical task. The final book of the Republic is sort of like books 2 to 3 in reverse. Having revisited the topic of music in Callipolis and the Poets, and finalized the arguments from books 3 and 2, the very end of the Republic returns to the fundamental definition of justice and the wages of injustice in terms of the soul and the afterlife. You may recall that Plato had initially turned to the Poets for wisdom and adages about the wages of justice versus injustice and the religious structure of the cosmos as one defined by justice. But he had also proposed to censor the Poets at this point for some of their more problematic statements about the nature of the gods, particularly Zeus and the two urns, the urn of good fates and the urn of bad ones. We can read the concluding myth of the Republic, the myth of air, as a good example of the type of poetic mythology and religious conception that Plato would approve of in Callipolis for the sake of the education of the guardians and everyone else. Plato's vision of the soul in the afterlife and a cosmos determined by justice departs yet again, like in the critique of the Poets, from the Homeric picture of the afterlife. You may recall from our unit on the soul in the Pre-Socratics that the Homeric picture of the underworld is not clearly defined. The heroes form a special group in a meadow of asphodel, but no paradise is described like in the Elysian fields of later authors. The psyche in Hades is a vague spirit driven by passions and drifting joylessly in the gloom. The flitting life of the shades is one of recall and memory, but is entirely passive, that is, devoid of any active savor for the essence of life. In Homer, the group of the greatest mythological sinners occupy a special hell, but this is not clearly defined, and there is no mention of the souls of ordinary mortals who must also end up in Hades like everyone else. Plato's originality and novelty in the myth of air, which is also world literature's first near-death experience report, is to integrate aspects of the Homeric underworld with Pythagorean and Orphic conceptions about the afterlife, and at the same time to situate them all within an entirely new vision, not only of the underworld or Hades, but also of the heavenly realm, and finally of an in-between space, or liminal realm, what will eventually in Catholic theology become purgatory, but which Plato describes as the essential realm of the soul seeking rebirth, after having spent enormous eons of time in either the underworld or in the heavens. The myth of air is Plato's final allegory of cosmic justice, and in this way its importance exceeds even his allegory of education, the myth of the cave. It focuses not on what occurs in heaven or in hell, but in this uncanny liminal between, which is the prerequisite for new birth and embodiment, according to Plato's own version of the Pythagorean transmigration of the soul. It has been read as a genuine statement of Plato's own eschatology or vision of what happens after life. But it also has been understood as the final noble lie of the Republic. In my view, this reading is incorrect, and Plato in fact believes every word of what he communicates regarding Air's journey. The tale begins when, after 12 days of deathly slumber, the young warrior Air, a Pamphylian soldier, awakens on a funeral pyre just in the nick of time. More recently, anthropologists have found many near-death experience reports like this in the world's religious and shamanistic literatures. What Air bears with him is a fabulous account of the places his psyche has traveled in the dreamlike world of the beyond, a sequence of mysterious locales. The word Plato uses here is topon daimonion, that is, uncanny places, and there are 3 of them in the air myth. First, a festive meadow with souls going up and down, trading places, then a rainbow and spindle of necessity, the goddess Anake, over which sirens sing along with the Fates or Moirai, and finally a desolate field with a river running through it. Let's look at each of these 3 topon daimonion, or spiritual uncanny places. First, the conversational meadow. Souls arrive here in moderate-sized groups, and it is a place into which they emerge from 2 adjacent openings in the earth and 2 in the heavens above. At the entry point to the conversational meadows, judges are seated between them. From the opening in the earth, souls come up parched and dusty, but from the door in heaven, souls come down katabanai, that is pure. All who have just arrived have come from a long journey, so that they all go gladly to the meadow where they encamp as at a festival. The mythology of the conversational meadow already recalls a few things common in the Greek understanding of the afterlife, in which we often find meadows of Persephone or meadows of Asphodel, as well as an emphasis on memory and conversation as a kind of festivity. There's also an egalitarian dimension to the conversational meadow, since all the souls who arrive there embrace each other and converse, and those who had come up from the earth asked those who came down from the heaven about the things above and were questioned by them in turn. They told their stories to one another, the former weeping and lamenting as they recollected all they had suffered and seen on their journey below the earth, which lasted 1,000 years, and the ones from the heavens telling in turn about their happy experiences and the inconceivably beautiful sights they had seen. But the gist, he said, was this: for all the unjust things they had done and for all the people they had wronged, they had paid the penalty for everyone in turn 10 times over. And on the other hand, if they had done good deeds and become just and pious, they received commensurate rewards in heaven. We can already see how influential the myth of air is for later Christian eschatology. Now, the meadow isn't only love and light, for the souls in the underworld are sometimes incurably bad people and try to arrive back in the meadow by storm. If they have not paid sufficient penalty and try to go up, then savage men, all fiery to look at, stand by, paying attention to the soul and grabbing some of these people and leading them back to their torment. These are the fiery daimons, associated with sin in the underworld. Air apparently witnessed one of these escape attempts, and the fiery daimons took Ardias and bound his feet and hands and neck, and threw him down and flayed him, and dragged him along the road, lacerating him on thorn bushes, dragging him back and throwing him in Tartarus. Plato's vision here is certainly a bit gruesome. Now, after having spent 7 days in the meadow telling each other their stories of 1,000 years in heaven and hell, on the 8th day this specific group moves on from there and continues the journey to the second daimonic location. In 4 days they came to a place where they could see stretching from above through the whole heavens and earth a straight beam of light like a column, very closely resembling a rainbow but brighter and more pure. They reached the beam after traveling another day's journey, and there, in the middle of the light, they saw stretching from heavens the ends of its bonds, the desmon tetamina. The light is what binds the heavens like cables underneath a trireme, thus holding the entire revolving universe together. From these ends hangs the spindle of necessity, by means of which all the revolving things are turned. So this second sight, or the spindle of Lady Necessity, the goddess Anake, can be a bit difficult to visualize at first, but Plato's basic idea can be traced to this image of Greek spindles with whorls, with spooled thread moving up and down the notches. In all likelihood, the spindle of Lady Necessity looked something like this, but more writ large on a visionary scale of the cosmos. There's the goddess Anake, who sits in the center of the spindles, as well as her 3 daughters, the Fates, in Greek Moirai or Latin Parcae. What this primordial religious visionary scene reveals is the way in which all events in the cosmos are woven into a kind of cosmic quilt fabric by Lady Necessity and the Fates. Not only does the goddess Anake sit weaving the cosmic quilt work with her Fates, but the myth of air also encapsulates Plato's view of the heavenly spheres, which are overseen and guided by 9 sirens. The spindle revolved on the lap of necessity. On the top of each of its circles stood a siren, who was carried around by its rotation, emitting a single sound, one single note. And from all 8 in concord, a single harmony was produced, and there were 3 other women seated around it, equidistant from one another, each on a throne. They were the daughters of necessity, the Fates, Moirai, dressed in white with garlands on their heads, Lachesis, Clotho, and Atropos, and they sang in accompaniment to the sirens' harmony, Lachesis singing of the past, Clotho of the present, and Atropos of the future. The to us almost silent, but to the Fates and the souls completely audible music of the sirens is the self-same music that the Pythagoreans describe as the music of the spheres. A bit more on the 3 Fates, or Moirai, whose name means allotted portions. In Hesiod, they were daughters of Zeus and Themis, the goddess of law, justice, nomos. They are here described by Plato as the very source and origin of time and temporality. Clotho, the youngest Fate, is the spinner of the thread of life, the giver of birth, and she uses her right hand to spin the outer circumference of the spindle, and she sings in harmony with the sirens of the present. Lachesis is the middle Fate, the measurer of the thread of life, the decider of destinies, or the disposer of lots. She uses each hand in turn to spin the outer circumference and thread it with life, and she sings of the past. Atropos is the eldest Fate, or cutter of the thread of life, the ineluctable one, and she uses her left hand to spin the inner circumference of the spindle, and what she sings of is the future. Importantly, it is Lachesis, or the Fate of the past, the measurer and decider of life and destiny, before which the souls arriving at the spindle receive an audience. And she speaks in her own voice here in the myth of air, the words of Lachesis, daughter of necessity. Ephemeral souls, the beginning of another death-bringing cycle for mortal kind. Your daimon will not be assigned to you by lot. You will choose him, and the one who has the first lot will be the first to choose a life to which he will be bound by necessity. Virtue has no master. As he honors or dishonors it, so shall each of you have more or less of it. Responsibility lies with the chooser. The god is blameless. More simply, the souls are about to be reborn and thus consigned to life and death. According to the Greek conception, each soul, so long as it lives, will be attached to a spiritual double, or daimon. Lots will be drawn, so those with the longest sticks will have more lives to choose from in a particular batch. Daimon is not master of virtue and vice in the soul. Rather, it rests with the psyche itself to choose virtue, to honor it, and to take responsibility for his own choice. This is where Plato connects the air myth to the theme of justice in the Republic and its ground, which is knowledge of the good. Because all individual lives have a mixture of good and bad inheritance, with resultant blessings and tragic fates, the ability to distinguish a good life from a bad requires a high degree of philosophical wisdom. The more philosophical a soul is, the more it chooses not only out of a desire for pleasure or power, but based on rational prediction of how the mixtures of qualities and circumstances in a given life create the potentiality for spiritual advancement. And another egalitarian moment, the souls who are coming down from heaven have been so pampered in a heavenly realm, traveling in the choruses of the gods, that they have become completely untrained in suffering. The souls coming up from the earth, however, have suffered so much that they are much more wary and circumspect in choosing. And so, according to Air and Plato, what happens here is that the souls tend to switch places. The ones coming down from heaven, by mistake, choosing a life that will probably lead them to hell. The ones coming up from hell, being much more humble and choosing a life least likely to lead them to perdition. Only the souls who tend to reside in Tartarus and are almost incurably bad will continually display bad choices in their next rebirth, luck here having very little to do with it. Philosophical wisdom is needed to chart a middle course. And although there is an element of luck based on the pulling of lots and lining up to choose one's life, this element of luck is minimized, the element of responsibility and of wisdom being underlined. Indeed, so long as the philosophical soul does not get a completely bottom-of-the-barrel lot, he is more likely to transition from mortal life to heaven. Or even given very limited choices about his next rebirth, the philosophical soul will choose with wisdom. This deification of Anarche, or goddess of necessity, is also connected in Greek religious thought with the goddess Dike, and some scholars have proposed Parmenides' journey with the Heliades to the ultimate horizon gateways of night and justice, beyond which an unnamed goddess speaks, is the primary religious and literary precursor of Plato's myth of air, and even that the goddess we are more used to calling Aletheia, who speaks to Parmenides, is Anarche, or necessity herself. Some Orphic cosmogonies indeed worship Chronos Anarche, or time necessity, as the first and supreme goddess of the cosmos. And in the later Orphic hymn to justice we hear, I sing of the all-seeing eye of comely and radiant Dike, who sits on the sacred throne of Lord Zeus. From heaven you look down on the lives of the many human races and crush the unjust with just retribution, matching things disparate with fairness and truth. For whenever base men consider matters that cannot be put to trial easily, unjustly wishing more than is fair, you intervene and rouse justice against the unjust. An enemy to the unjust, you are a gentle companion to the just. But goddess, come in justice for thoughts that are noble, until that fated day on my life descends. There are not only Orphic elements in Plato's account of the myth of air, but also Pythagorean ones, especially its emphasis on the transmigration of the soul. In fact, in the situation of choosing a life before Lachesis, all animal and all human lives are up for grabs. In even very notable humans such as Orpheus, Thamyris, Ajax, Agamemnon, or Thersites, on account of their attitudes and past experience, such as misogyny, love of music, misanthropy, or low breeding, end up choosing animal lives and become swans, nightingales, lions, eagles, or apes. It is not only the souls of humans but also of animals that are part of this cosmic transmigrational recycling. And the more musical animals tend to choose human lives to improve their skill. Very often, men become women, tyrants become beggars, and famous people become private. These are all elements of Pythagorean transmigration, and to explore this topic in further detail, I recommend James Luke's book, Pythagoras and the Doctrine of Transmigration. The third daimonic location in the journey through the absolute horizon or beyond, described in the air myth, is the desolate field. Having received their daimon and particular assignment to a life, then, without turning around, they went from under the throne of necessity, and when all of them had passed through, they traveled Poiesis to the plain of forgetfulness, Tolethis Pedion, in burning, choking, terrible heat, for it was empty of trees and earthly vegetation, Gefuai. And there, beside the river of carefree, Amelita Potamon, whose water no vessel can contain, they camped, for night was coming on. Notice that this part of the myth of air does not describe a river of Lethe, but rather what is described is a desert or a plain of forgetfulness, Tolethis Pedion. And like in Egyptian and Orphic descriptions of the afterlife, here the soul is incredibly parched, and indeed nothing grows at all. Nevertheless, in the middle of this absolute desert, there is the river of carefree, the Amelita Potamon, the image of a water that no vessel can contain, being a veiled reference to the Eleusinian initiates, who must be more or less like leaky vessels with respect to the sacred truths that are revealed in the great initiations. Here, all the souls are required to drink a certain measure of the water. But those who are not saved by wisdom, phronisai, drink more than that, and as each of them drink, they forget everything and fall into a deep sleep. The reason why air was able to recall his journey through the three demonic locations is because a messenger prevented him from drinking of this river. A very clever and convenient explanation for why he remembered the journey. Having drunk from the river and fallen into a deep slumber, around midnight there is a great clap of thunder and an earthquake, and all the souls in the group are suddenly carried away from there, this way and that, up to their birth like shooting stars. This third demonic location, the field of forgetting, with the river of carefree running through it, is particularly reminiscent of Orphic mythological eschatologies, such as in the Petelia gold leaf first discovered in 1867. You will find to the left of the mansion of Hades a spring, and standing by it a white cypress. Do not even approach this spring, but on the other side, from the lake of memory, Nemosune, you will find water flowing fresh. And very nearby there are some guardians. Say, I am the child of earth and starry heaven, but my race is heavenly. You yourself know this. I am dry with thirst and dying. Give me quickly water flowing fresh from the lake of memory. And they will give you water to drink from the sacred spring, and afterwards you will reign among the gods and other heroes. The more in-depth comparison of the various Greek eschatologies Homeric, Orphic, Pythagorean, and now Platonic, could be the subject of a term paper if you'd like to reach out for sources. So we arrive at the final words of the Republic. So, Glycon, this tale of air was saved and not lost, and it would save us too if we are persuaded by it, since we would safely cross the river Lethe, this being Plato's own shorthand here for the river in the field of Lethe, with our souls undefiled. But if we are persuaded by me, we will believe that the soul is immortal and able to endure every evil and also every good, and always holds to the upward path. This being very influential for Christian doctrines of the incorruptibility of the soul, practicing justice with wisdom every way we can, so that we will be friends to ourselves and to the God, both while we remain here on earth and when we receive the rewards of justice, and go around like victors in the games collecting prizes. And so both in this world and on the 1,000-year journey we have described, we will fare well. Here, Plato's myth, supposedly based on an actual near-death experience report, combines his doctrine of the immortality of the soul with the doctrines of heaven and hell, and an account of reincarnation, as well as a Greek purgatory, all designed to give the final demonstration that we live in a cosmos determined by necessity and justice. Clearly, the myth is colored by its cultural context, but so are all religious scriptures and myths that describe the afterlife. And Plato's myth of air, being now in company with the Egyptian papyrus of Ani, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the Mayan Popol Vuh, the Aztec Nepantla, as well as Judaic-Christian and Islamic eschatologies. To Neoplatonic influence on early Christian authors, the air myth has been extremely influential and is the precursor or foil to the formulation of the Christian concepts of hell and purgatory from St. Augustine to Dante's Divine Commedia. So we're coming now to the end of our study of Plato and moving on to Aristotle next week. Of course, Plato's collected works is huge and we've only scratched the surface. The topic of philosophical religion and the affinity or difference of Plato and Socrates, these are questions which will probably never be fully resolved. But we can note that Plato is indeed an inheritor of Socrates' emphasis on religious and ethical reform, as well as attempting to ground a new way of life more religiously devoted to the search for truth as revealed to the soul or conscience rather than official dogma. Recall how in the Euthyphro we witnessed Socrates attempting to naturalize both religion and morality thought together as piety. What is pious, just, holy, good, true, beautiful are so by nature and can be understood through rational inquiry rather than myth or divine command. It is from out of this Socratic instinct for the nature of the pious, the just, the holy, the good, the true, the beautiful, etc., that we see the first glimmers and inklings of Plato's development of the theory of forms. Did Socrates believe, like Plato, that the soul is immortal and that at death the philosopher's soul returns to the world of the forms, which is heavenly and wonderful? Did he give this Socratic conviction a great deal of color and exoticism rooted in traditional Greek religions such as Orphism? Or was he rather importing this theory of the soul, the forms, and the afterlife based on his own Pythagorean views, thereby erasing from historical memory a more agnostic Socrates? We simply don't know for certain. In my view, the real historical Socrates is most likely to have taught doctrines quite similar to Plato's, just without many of the flourishes. Indeed, from the Socratic way of life, with the equation of Socratic rationality, reason equals goodness equals truth equals virtue, to religious beliefs about death, the soul, learning as recollection, the forms, and the afterworld journey, we may not have to travel nearly as far as commentators often assume, even if it is only in Plato that we receive the first comprehensive metaphysical theory of everything. From the myth of the cave, situated in the overall argument of Plato's Republic, we learned about Plato's two-world ontology, which is the first systematic ontology in Western thought, the world of reason or intellect, the supersensible world, versus the world of images, beliefs, and imagining, or the sensible one. The journey of liberation from the cave, from this world, is framed in terms of the metaphor of the education of the soul, and at the same time it is a mystical and philosophical religious journey of initiation into higher, immortal, divine realities, the true world, and the essence of cosmic justice. Far from being a purely logical or merely rationalistic instrument, Plato utilizes reason or logos, defined as the most defined attribute of the soul, as a privileged mode of access to revealed religious truths. And this is clear in many of the myths we studied in Plato, and especially in the myth of air. The debt of Plato's philosophy to traditional Greek religion, clearly visible in these more mythical sides of Plato's narratives. Although earlier scholarship had tended to take the myth-making Plato as an unfortunate residue in an otherwise rational thinker devoted to logos over mythos, the fact is that more recent scholarship has vindicated the mythic Plato and emphasized the centrality of Plato's myths to his philosophical religion. The story of the afterworld journey of transmigrating souls, far from being a noble lie, reflects Plato's own theoretical belief about what happens to the soul after death, and it fuses elements of the Homeric and Pythagorean Orphic eschatology into Plato's mature viewpoint on the nature of the soul and the ultimate structure of reality. Important details of Plato's account of the soul's journey through the afterlife are further explained in the Phaedrus, where the liberated philosophic soul travels with the gods to the meadow of truth, or falls back again into the muck of this world. What is more, this world is continuous throughout to the true world of the forms and its divine beings, and so at the conclusion of the Republic, we see Plato's emphasis on the care of the soul or its salvation, soteria, soteros, the soul's soteriology, as being the chief reason to pursue rational inquiry and a philosophical way of life. In the Timaeus we hear, if our hearts have been fixed on the love of learning and true wisdom, and we have exercised that part of ourselves above all, we are surely bound to have immortal or divine thoughts if we should grasp the truth, nor can we fail to possess immortality to the highest degree that human nature admits. In the words of Werner Jager, though philosophy means death to the old gods, it is itself a religion, and it is in Plato that the transcendence of the divine world order becomes clearly marked for the first time. And resolved in Plato's grand synthesis and first systematic ontology is the contrast between his egalitarian principles of education and the universality of the soul, on the one hand, and his elitist focus on a philosophical education and the true religion which flows from it, only accessible to very few. In any case, we may conclude our discussion of the Republic in the words of one of the most perceptive Plato scholars, Auguste Diez, in 1927, when he writes, "There is certainly such a thing as Plato's religion. It derives from his philosophy, it obeys the same principles and expresses the same aspirations, and it is, so to speak, the culmination and the flower of that philosophy." Lastly, this week, let's return and say farewell now to Karatani, briefly summarize his reading of Plato and Plato's Republic at the end of his chapter on Socrates and Empire. According to Karatani, both Plato's theory of knowledge as recollection and amnesis and his idea of the philosopher king derive from Pythagoras. This kind of thinking cannot possibly come from Socrates, for Socrates' service to the state was strictly prescribed. Karatani also helpfully points us to the connections between Plato's seventh letter and the Republic, noting that the idea that the philosopher king is Plato's own is clear from the seventh letter, and I was forced to say, when praising true philosophy, that it is by this that men are enabled to see what justice in public and private life really is. Therefore, I said, there will be no cessation of evils for the sons of men, till either those who are pursuing a right and true philosophy receive sovereign power in the states, or those in power in the states by some dispensation of providence become true philosophers. According to Karatani, Plato came to associate with Socrates towards the end of his life, but never considered living as he did. He never lost his aspiration to be involved in the affairs of the state. However, once the democratic faction brought capital charges against Socrates, Plato became suspect to both sides and found the road to politics closed off. In fact, foreseeing further retaliation by the democratic faction against the aristocrats after Socrates' death, he ended up fleeing Athens as well, which commenced Plato's period of wandering that lasted for about 10 years, during which period he resolved to forego politics and become a philosopher. As he again writes in the seventh letter, "Finally, it became clear to me with regard to all existing communities that they were one and all misgoverned, and their laws have got into a state that is almost incurable except by some extraordinary reform, with good luck to support it." During the period of his wandering, we thus find Plato in Syracuse, with the hopes of putting his ideas about the philosopher king into practice, and at the same time in Italy deepening his exchange with the Pythagoreans and their leader at the time, Archytas. Plato subsequently crossed to the island of Sicily and visited the tyrant of Syracuse, Dionysius I. And there he also met Dionysius's brother-in-law, Dion, a beautiful youth who loved philosophy and formed the hope that a government by a philosopher king might be realized in Syracuse. However, Plato's political experience in Syracuse was disastrous. He was nearly sold into slavery after incurring the wrath of the tyrant and beat a hasty retreat to Athens, where he founded an academy resembling the school of the Pythagoreans. He subsequently returned to Syracuse 2 more times and suffered the same setbacks. He was, in a word, duped by the tyrants. For Plato, according to Karatani, democracy became untenable precisely because it is what put Socrates to death. The excess of liberty, whether in states or individuals, seems only to pass into the excess of slavery. What then is to be done? During the period that he was mulling over this question, Plato came in contact with the school of Pythagoreans and found their rule by the philosophers. In Pythagoras as well, the freedom of the people ends in tyranny, and people are not truly free until they are released from the prison of the flesh. Of course, Plato relates the idea of the philosopher king in the Republic as if it were an idea of Socrates. But Socrates was against a two-world theory. In the political sphere, the dual world consists in the division between public and private, which Socrates sought to overcome as a private citizen. And of course, Socrates never thought completely that he had attained a world of truth. Plato, picking up from his mentor, aimed at a condition where the soul ruled over the body, but for Karatani, what Socrates aimed at was the abolition of rule itself, that is to say, isonomia. And so in Plato, the thinking of Socrates was turned upside down, the philosopher becoming the one who transcends the sensible world of semblance and grasps the truth, and who is furthermore active in public affairs and through the possession of political power realizes truth in the political world. Karatani then helpfully maps the developments of Book 8 and 9 of the Republic in terms of his fundamental concept of isonomia. What it proposes is the rule of the one and the rule of the few, or royalty and aristocracy, and how he undermines the concept of isonomia by associating rule without law with tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy. What is important here is that Plato conceived of a 7th possibility beyond these 6. If we divide each of these, we shall have 6, from which the true one may be distinguished as the 7th in Plato's own words. And this is the rule by philosopher kings. If we must be isonomial, then democracy will be the best. But if we are well ordered, then this is the last we should choose, as royalty is the first form and the best, with the exception of the 7th, for that it far excels them all, and is among the states what God is among men. Between the axis of equality and the axis of freedom, Karatani thus situates Plato's philosopher king as a movement towards equality within despotism. Socrates' aim was to dismantle the dual world of public and private existence that served as the premise of Athenian democracy, and this meant nothing other for him than the restoration of isonomia. Plato, on the other hand, held democracy itself responsible for Socrates' death. It is democracy that gives rise to tyranny and demagoguery. In order to evade this fate, what is required is not the opinions of the masses, but an order ruled by philosophers. In other words, Plato took it as his life's work to drive out the Ionian spirit that touched off Athenian democracy. His 2 crucial tasks being the rejection of the idea of a matter that moves itself and a securing of the idea that the soul rules matter. This is clearly the construction of a theology. Moreover, Plato carried this project out from first to last under the name of Socrates. And as a result, from the time of Plato onwards, the origin of philosophy have been taken to reside in Socrates. And by extension, from the time of Nietzsche on, the critique of Plato has taken the form of an attack on Socrates, with the key to transcending Platonic philosophy taken to reside in the Pre-Socratics. However, if one wants to properly consider the Pre-Socratics, one must include Socrates in their number. He was the last person to try to reinstitute Ionian thought and politics. In order to refute Platonic metaphysics and theology, it is precisely Socrates that is required. Okay, I hope you've enjoyed these 2 videos explaining Plato's Republics, books 1 to 7, and now 7 to 10. Look forward to seeing you next week when we begin our first of 2 units on Aristotle. Have a good week.